Hello, everyone. This is the Think and Read podcast. I am Tom Vieira. In our world, we say, be yourself, or be true to yourself, or you do you. We say these as matters of advice or suggestions, or even as matters of wisdom. And yet we don't realize sometimes that what lies behind these suggestions is some assumption about ourselves, that we can know ourselves. There's something called a self. In this episode, I want to explore Michel de Montaigne's thoughts about the self. And I want to take up the question, based on what he presents to us, might it be possible that we think of Montaigne as the first modern philosopher? I hope you enjoy this episode. If you want to find more episodes, please find the Think and Read podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Don't forget to subscribe. Thanks so much. About 100 miles west of Athens, up in the mountains on Mount Parnassus, sits the ancient city of Delphi. And Delphi was the home of the temple of Apollo, and the priestess of Apollo was there, the Pythia. And she would give these oracles, these prophecies. People from all over the Greek world, sometimes coming at great distances, would come to get some sort of prophecy, some insight about their life. And what's interesting is on the temple itself was inscribed probably the most famous Greek proverb of them all, which is know thyself. And if we read pre-modern texts, anything from, say, Plato and Aristotle, or Stoic and Epicurean writers, poets like Virgil, and so anyway, we can get a kind of a rough idea of what that saying, know thyself, meant, at least broadly. And it had something to do with knowing your limits, knowing your strengths and weaknesses, knowing your tendencies, that sort of thing. And that makes perfect sense, right? Because if you're coming to Delphi and you want to get some prophecy about your life, that's not going to do you a whole lot of good if you have a bad sense of who you are, right? A bad understanding of your abilities, what you're actually good at, what you're not very good at, what bad or good habits you have, and so on. Well, all of this points to the main focus of, let's say, classical moral thinking, which is it's about living well, right? It's about the good life. It's about how to be happy. Okay, so it's not a shock, given that Montaigne is a Renaissance writer, he's a Renaissance thinker, that he is concerned with this idea of self-knowledge, and he's sort of drawing, of course, from the classical tradition, as all Renaissance writers and artists and so on do. They're looking to the Greco-Roman culture for inspiration, right, in all these areas. But Montaigne is as good of an example of a Renaissance individual as there is, because guys like him and Shakespeare and others, what they're doing is they're not just reaching back to the old and sort of resurrecting it, as it were. They're reapplying the old and doing something new with it. And that is most obvious to me in the way Montaigne reinvents the idea of the self. What Montaigne is doing when it comes to how we understand the self is new. And this is my main interest in this episode, is to explore what is new about his idea of the self. What's important here, I think, is that Montaigne really was looked at for quite a long time more for his style than anything else. He's, of course, the inventor of the modern essay, used as a kind of philosophical genre. He's very candid in the way he writes. So it's the stylistic value or the stylistic contribution of Montaigne that has been the main focus of scholars and philosophers for a long time, until maybe more recently. And in the sort of philosophical interest of Montaigne tends to focus mainly around his skepticism, his epistemology, his essay, The Apology of Raymond Sebon, which is really has more to do with his understanding of knowledge and how easily we can be deceived and so on. But I think it's here. I think it's what he has to say about the self that I believe is his most important and maybe most overlooked contribution. And I want to explore, actually, in this episode, whether there is a case to be made for Montaigne being the first modern philosopher. More on that later. Let's start here. In Shakespeare's play, Hamlet, we get this line: "This, above all, to thine own self be true." Okay, that's a very Shakespearean thing to say. Shakespeare, in a number of his plays, there is this theme of, of being true to yourself. We talk like that very commonly now, right? You want to know yourself and be true to yourself and be genuine in that sense. And here's the interesting thing. If we were to ask Shakespeare, right, he would say that's a very Montaigne thing to say. Shakespeare was deeply influenced by Montaigne. And I think this is important because the late, great literary critic Harold Bloom, he wrote a book on Shakespeare. He was a Shakespeare scholar. And he makes the case that Shakespeare should be credited with the invention of personality. And he means something kind of unique by this, okay? And I think he's onto something here that with Shakespeare, you get this new idea, a very modern idea of the self, personality, okay? It's different than the classical understanding of the self. And we probably should maybe unpack that a little bit. What was the classical understanding and how did that seemed to change, okay? So when you go back, again, to the pre-modern text, you look at the classical tradition on knowing yourself, the idea here the self has to do with certain potentialities or faculties. You have the faculty of reason, and there's passion, and Plato talks about the different parts of the soul, right? And there's with that, then, this idea of cultivating those powers, cultivating those faculties, which is what we call virtue, right? You want to cultivate those well so that you are functioning in this full, flourishing sense as a human being. And the disagreement had to do with what really made you human, right? And what does that sort of virtue look like, and so on. But the shared sense was still the same, that the self is a collection of potentialities like seeds in the ground that need to be cultivated into something that flourishes. What we get in the modern sense of self is the idea of personality, the idea of uniqueness. In the classical tradition, you would emphasize the common, that which we share as human beings. So it goes in this sort of category of anthropology, right? It goes in the category of the universal, that which is common to human beings. In the modern sense of self, we emphasize the particular. We emphasize the unique, that which makes you you and different from everyone else in the world. And it feeds right into this idea of being true to yourself. And there's that word self there, which has a loaded meaning in the way we tend to think of that. And I think Bloom is absolutely right to look to Shakespeare as a major contributor to this understanding of the individual personality or your sense of self. And we can start to see, right, when we take the Greek saying, know thyself, it takes on a nuanced meaning, a fundamentally different meaning, you could argue, once we understand the self as uniqueness or personality. But here's the thing. The 19th century German philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche, who was himself an avid reader of Montaigne, he once said this about Shakespeare. He said that Shakespeare was Montaigne's best reader. Now, that's really interesting because I think what Nietzsche is saying is that we should be careful to overemphasize the development of Shakespeare as though it were unique to himself, his, original idea, as it were, of human personality. That, in other words, Shakespeare owes a lot to the thinking of Montaigne. And there is some evidence for this because in 1603, and scholars of Shakespeare have noticed that plays after this date tend to take on a different focus. There's more of an emphasis on introspection. A character like Hamlet, for example, right, who has this sense of self and the place of introspection and so on. So in any case, the date 1603 is important because John Florio, translator of Montaigne, right, he publishes a new translation of Montaigne's essays. And we also know that Shakespeare devoured those essays. It was really influenced by Montaigne. And so, kind of a pushback on Bloom a little bit is to say, look, I think we need to actually dig into Montaigne to really see where this new idea of self is coming from. And so I want to do that in this episode. I want to look at two particular essays. There's a number of places we can go, but these two essays are, I think, particularly interesting. They're worth reading, and they're very helpful in trying to get at least a beginning sense of Montaigne's understanding of the self. And the first one is called On Solitude. It's in Book One, which was his first collection of essays that he published. And then the second essay that I want to look at is On Repentance, and that is in Book Three, which he published. It was the last set, and it's published not long before he died. Okay, so first, the essay On Solitude. The very first thing that Montaigne goes after here is the idea of true solitude, because that's not the same thing as just simply a change of scenery, right? Like, you can't just change your circumstances and expect some new magical thing to happen in your life that, all of a sudden things are going to be better. And we get that, right? The grass is not always greener on the other side, that sort of thing. He writes, it's not enough to go to another place. We have to withdraw from such attributes of the mob that are within us. It is our own self we have to isolate and take back into possession. So he's going to be working with this idea of yourself. We have to take ourselves back into possession. And he will even say that it's not necessary that you have to be in some remote place or in the country, that sort of thing. He says, by ridding ourselves of court and marketplace, we do not rid ourselves of the principal torments of our life. He brings up this interesting story, this passage from Socrates. Apparently he was told at one point about a man who had traveled and was not improved by the fact. And Socrates apparently said, I'm sure he was not. He went with himself. So, right. It's said sometimes that, wherever you go, there you are. Right. So, okay. This is not anything really new. I don't think of course he's quoting from Socrates here and so on. So, that itself is not a new idea, that you can't just change your circumstances and expect to change yourself. But there is this interesting notion here that we have to take ourselves back into possession. What does that mean? He writes a little bit later in the essay, so we must bring her back, haul her back into ourself. That is true solitude. He has this idea of ourself, or yourself, which is not, again, this notion of classical virtue, classical anthropology. This is a notion of self as uniqueness or identity. And we have to discover that. We have to reclaim that if we're going to be happy. So he writes again, let us make our happiness depend on ourselves. Let us gain power over ourselves to live really and truly alone. So to live really and truly alone does not necessarily mean you're literally and truly alone. He says that, that you getting married is a good thing. We ought to have wives and children and property and above all good health if we can. But we should also not become so attached to these things that our happiness depends on these things. We should set aside a room just for ourselves at the back of the shop, keeping it entirely free and establishing there our true liberty, our principal solitude and asylum. Within it, our normal conversation should be of ourselves, with ourselves, so privy that no commerce, no communication with the outside world should find a place there. There we should talk and laugh as though we had no wife, no children, no possessions, no followers, no men servants, so that when the occasion arises that we must lose them, it should not be a new experience to do without them. So you see, right, that this is not Pascal sitting quietly alone in a room thinking about eternity. That's not what Montaigne has in mind here. It's sitting alone quietly in a room, having a conversation with yourself, getting to know yourself, and it's self in the unique sense of self, the individualist sense of self, not in that which we share in common. And so the most famous line from this essay on solitude now makes a lot of sense. The greatest thing in the world is to belong to yourself, or sometimes translated as how to live to yourself. Okay, so out of this, it now makes sense why we would talk about the idea of genuineness, something that we take very seriously in our culture today, in the modern West, that you are to be true to yourself, you are to be genuine, and we have ideas of hypocrisy as kind of a cardinal sin, if you will, a cardinal cultural sin, resting on that idea of uniqueness and individuality in your true self. We owe this idea to Montaigne, I would argue, more than to Shakespeare. Shakespeare popularizes this. Shakespeare puts this out in front of us in a way that is unforgettable and remarkable and brilliant, masterful. But the idea is Montaigne's. And so he says toward the end of this essay, you should no longer be concerned with what the world says of you, but with what you say to yourself. So is that right? That idea of being genuine, being true to yourself. And then he goes on, he says, withdraw into yourself, but first prepare yourself to welcome yourself there. Okay, so there's that mixture of the old and the new. That you can almost hear Seneca speaking right through this page here. He's, this idea of being primarily concerned with your own virtue, not worrying about those around you, tending to yourself as an individual. That there are things in Seneca for sure that talk about that, but it has this idea again of cultivating the virtue or the latent potentialities that is within you, which is what we mean by virtue. But he's also talking about this sort of idea of withdrawing into yourself, getting comfortable with yourself, as though the self were its own unique entity. In fact, I would even describe it this way. I think we're looking right now at Montaigne's invention, the birth of the modern self. We want to put it like that, or the beginnings maybe of this idea of the modern self. I would describe it this way, as an entity uniquely complex that exists by nature, not nurture, which we have to discover, sort of like one discovering, new lands, right? Or new planets. There's something that's there, that's always been there, but we've forgotten. we've maybe taken on false senses or ideas of identity by borrowing them from the culture around us, mimicking things that we see around us. And this idea of mimicking has actually been a really central concept in moral thought since antiquity. And so you see something of the undermining here. Yes, he is pulling from the old, but he's undermining some of that old and cultivating, inventing in some sense a new idea of the self. In fact, it might be worth remembering, I'm thinking of it now, a very helpful summary of the old idea of the human person that was provided by Alistair MacIntyre, the great 20th century philosopher, in his book After Virtue. He says something like this, that the sort of underlying assumption, whether it's Platonic or Aristotelian or Stoic or whatever it is, Epicurean, right? The underlying assumption was always what he described as teleological, that human beings were supposed to develop into something, right? We are supposed to develop into a particular form or particular expression of our true nature. And so the whole scheme, he says, rests on this fundamental distinction between human beings as we happen to be and human beings as we could be if we cultivated or realized our essential nature. That is not what Montaigne is talking about here. That disappears from the scene with Montaigne. And so something new is emerging, I think. And we get a fairly decent idea of what he's talking about, both there in the essay on solitude, but also as we move now to the essay on repenting, which is again in book 3. It's one of his later essays, and it is really fascinating, especially the opening few pages. I'm going to read the opening lines of this essay because he's a brilliant writer, and how he conveys this idea of himself is, I think, particularly important. Others form man. I give an account of man. So that kind of forming man versus accounting is really, I think, interesting. I give an account of man and sketch a picture of a particular one of them who is very badly formed and who I would truly make very different from what he is if I had to fashion him afresh. But it is done now. The brushstrokes of my portrait do not go awry, even though they do change and vary. So there's this sort of confidence he has in his sense of the who-ness, right, of himself, who he is. He's not necessarily what. He's not concerned with what. He's concerned with more of who. And he puts it in terms of a self-portrait. He says, the brushstrokes of my portrait do not go awry. He doesn't make mistakes in conveying who he truly is by way of these essays. Okay. But he does say who he is changes and varies. So there's that's a really interesting idea that is part of his skepticism. He sees the world as in flux. He will go on to say that the world is but a perennial seesaw. Everything in it, the land, mountains, he kind of makes a list, all waver with a common motion of their own. Constancy itself is nothing but a more languid rocking, to and fro. I am unable to stabilize my subject. It staggers confusedly along with a natural drunkenness. I grasp it as it is now, at this moment when I am lingering over it. I am not portraying being, but becoming. Okay, that is fascinating. The being and becoming takes us back to the Greek world of thought, okay? And there's a lot of Heraclitus. If you're familiar with Heraclitus, there's a lot of Heraclitus going on in here. Heraclitus was a pre-Socratic philosopher who once said that no man steps into the same river twice because it's not the same river and he is not the same man. So in other words, Heraclitus is emphasizing that the world is full of change, right? Flux. Nothing remains the same. And so Montaigne is drawing from this, and he sees the world that way for sure, but he also sees himself in some sense that way, especially when we find ourselves in society. It's really hard for us to get a true sense of who we are, which is why Montaigne withdrew. It's part of why he withdrew anyway, that it's a lot easier when you are alone in solitude to get a true measure of yourself. But even that comes with a fair amount of flux. Okay, so now I think we can get to what I think is the most critical passage on this whole topic of Montaigne and the self. And if you know of a better passage, a clearer passage, or something that maybe undermines what I am suggesting, then please, leave a comment. Let me know. I want to know. But in this essay on repenting, Montaigne gets to this distinction between nature and nurture. It's a very familiar one to us. He talks about how, we have natural tendencies that are helped or reinforced by education. He talks about how his native tongue was Latin, and he understands it better than French, yet it's been 40 years since he used it in speaking or writing. You might remember that his father raised him speaking Latin, so he makes mention of that here. Yet he says, even though it's been that long, so he kind of links Latin with something that's native to him, right? Something that's closer to nature. Even though by custom and convention he is taken on speaking French. And then he says, nevertheless, on 2 or 3 occasions in his life, he suffered some extreme sudden emotion. And he talks about his father collapsing on him at one point. In any case, he says the first words which he dredged up from his entrails have always been in Latin. Interesting. Nature against long nurture, breaking forcibly out and finding expression. So he has this idea that there's this something within us that he's linking to nature, hides in some sense, or it can, under layers of, let's say, education, culture, what we think of as nurture. And then he says this. Just take a little look at what our experience shows. Provided that he listen to himself, there is no one who does not discover in himself a form entirely his own, a master form, which struggles against his education as well as against the storm of emotions which would gainsay it. In my case, I find that I am rarely shaken by shocks or agitations. I am virtually always settled in place, as heavy, ponderous bodies are. If I should be at home, I am always nearby. Okay, it's this line where he says, as long as we are listening to ourselves, okay, attending to that which is true within us, we will find within ourselves a form. So that has all kinds of Platonic suggestion attached to it, right? The idea of a form. But for Plato, the idea of a form is the essence of something, right? It's the universal. It captures the universal of whatever that is. So the form of a human being is that which is common to all human beings. The form of a horse is that which is common to all horses. But here, Montaigne is saying that we find within ourselves a form entirely our own, and he calls it, this sort of master form, which struggles against our education. That is really interesting. So there's this true self, which is and it's a particular, right? He's not talking about human nature. He's not talking about the essence of human nature. He's talking about personality, That's really what he's talking about, that it hides, right? It's sort of buried there underneath the layers of education, which presumably is the whole point of introspection now. It all kind of comes together. Why Montaigne is alone, why he's back at his family home, why he is reflecting on life away from society, away from the voices of other people, because he wants to discover that inner master form, his own I, or personality. This is quite different from anything that we have ever seen before. I want to wrap this episode up with a couple of considerations. First, I can't help but think of a marvelous little book. It's a novella by the Russian author Fyodor Dostoevsky, and the book is called Notes from the Underground. I will certainly get to that book at some point, but in that book, Dostoevsky arguably takes sort of the exact opposite approach, right, of Montaigne. You have this underground man. He's miserable. He's alone all the time, and he's consumed with himself, and his misery has a lot to do with the fact that he is by himself and absorbed within his own head, right? I think Dostoevsky would have a very different story to tell, in other words, about what Montaigne is talking about. Montaigne has this idea that somehow if we come to know ourselves and are comfortable in our own skin, as it were, we are familiar with ourselves, and that's where our peace is. That's where, if we can discover that inner master form that's there, but it presupposes that such a discovery is just sort of there waiting to happen, as it were. And sure, there's some flux that comes with that, but there's an I or an ego in there. And I think Dostoevsky has some real concerns about that. That retreat within your own self is not the discovery of peace and felicity, but comes pretty close to the darkness and the depths of hell. That's something I think for us to maybe ponder. Secondly, there's a passage from G.K. Chesterton that in his book Orthodoxy that I think summarizes the change that you're starting to see with Montaigne. And Descartes, again, is soon to come, who is influenced by Montaigne. Descartes himself would retreat, if we can put it that way, into his own mind, into his own head, and sort of doubt all things, and within his own head would come to find that which is undoubtedly true, etc. So that sort of modern retreat into one's own mind, I think, is the major turn from the classical to the new and the modern. So Chesterton, as I mentioned, would bring him up. He said, "We used to be doubtful about ourselves and certain about truth." And that's exactly the reverse now. That was sort of the classical tradition, the classical habit, or the classical culture was where humans as individuals really never made a big deal about themselves. We weren't preoccupied with our own individuality and our own personality and the need to discover that and the need to be genuine about that. What we were trying to do was to be really concerned about what was outside of ourselves, if I can put it that way, what's true in some objective sense, right? Where in the modern, we become certain about ourselves, doubtful about the truth. Something like that as a descriptive claim. This is not a critique necessarily of Montaigne. It's more of a descriptive claim about Montaigne. That seems accurate as a summary with Montaigne, that there's a sense in which Montaigne is going within himself to find some basis for certainty, some basis for happiness or some inner peace, while being doubtful about the world around him. So should we think of Montaigne as the first modern philosopher? Well, I think we should first avoid a key mistake if we're going to try to answer that question. And the mistake is this: to try to read history backward, to try to read into Montaigne our more full-blown ideas of self or individuality or personality, etc., that we really can only find beginnings of in Montaigne. Montaigne is a starting point, right? He does represent, I believe, a significant change in the way we understand ourselves. And I think that is this change that might actually be more basic, more profound than, let's say, the rationalism of Descartes, which did a great deal, of course, to help shape the modern world and the ways in which we think about the world more, let's say, mechanistically or more rationalistically. But all of what Descartes gave us rested on a prior commitment he had to Montaigne and his method. It was Montaigne that separated himself from schools of thought and from conventional assumptions, philosophic or otherwise, and sought his own way, try to find his own way of arriving at the truth. That's exactly what Descartes would do, and it becomes characteristic of modern philosophy. Descartes' findings were different, Descartes' conclusions were different, but the primacy of self and this idea of the self in connection with personality and uniqueness, it's hard to find something that's been more characteristically modern than that. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Our question, as always, is to think or not to think. Bye for now.